Hi there, this is Ashley Dawson. This is one in a series of videos that I'm making in conjunction with my recent book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons. And today I'm extremely excited to be joined by two guests from South Africa, Trevor Ngwane and Patrick Bond. Trevor Ngwane worked during the apartheid era as a sociology lecturer at Wits University in Johannesburg, where he helped found the Wits Workers School to teach literacy to campus cleaners and gardeners. He was the National Education Officer for the Transport and General Workers Union of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, which is one of the major labor formations in South Africa. And in 1995, he was elected Ward Councillor for Pimville in the township of Soweto on an African National Congress ticket. In 1999, he was expelled by the ANC for opposing the city of Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality's privatization of municipal services. And in reaction, in 2001, he helped found the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and then the Anti-Privatisation Forum in 2002, both of which campaign against the privatization of public services. I'm also joined by Patrick Bond, who is professor at the University of the Western Cape School of Government in Cape Town, having also served at two main universities in Johannesburg and Durban in the period from 1997 to 2019. After moving permanently from the US to Southern Africa in 1989, Patrick served township social movements working on financial justice based at the NGO Planact in Johannesburg. And then in 1995 and 1996, he worked in the Reconstruction and Development Ministry in President Nelson Mandela's office. Patrick is a prolific author whose best known work is Elite Transition from Apartheid to Neoliberalism in South Africa, but he's also published many other important books, including The Politics of Climate Justice, BRICS and Resistance in Africa, and Against Global Apartheid, just to name a few. Okay, so I want to get straight into our conversation, and I thought it would make sense, since my book is about the energy commons, to start out by asking Trevor about his experience with the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and the Anti-Privatisation Forum. Trevor, can you tell us a little bit about your experiences back in the late 90s and 2000s? What were some of the strategies that the organizations you helped to form used to fight against electricity cutoffs, and how are they relevant in the context of South Africa today?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Hi, Patrick. Yeah, so towards the end of the 90s, we had just gotten our freedom in 1994 under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. But then immediately after that, the African National Congress government, ANC, adopted a new policy, which was pro-big business, which was basically neoliberal. And then one consequence was residents were now being pressured to pay for services, water, electricity. And then one mechanism they were using to force residents to pay was to cut them off. So they cut your power supply. And then, many of us didn't like it. And then we organized. People were fighting spontaneously. So we just had to unite the struggles. And then we formed this Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. And then after a lot of pushing and pulling, trying this, trying that, we arrived at what I could call a trump card solution, which was, if they cut you off, we connect you. So that actually changed the, let's say, the balance of power between us and the government and the power supply company, Eskom, which is a public utility. Because before that, you would march, but they always said they reserve the right and hold the prerogative to cut you off. So you could negotiate. For example, I used to negotiate for, poor people, grannies, you know, so I take someone there and say, hey, this family has got a problem. So sometimes they would grant a concession, but increasingly they didn't. So they had that power. But when we started organizing together, it was clear that we had a trump card. We debated this because some people, especially some middle class types in the movement, who were part of, you know, our civic, felt that this was, you know, crossing a certain line. But it was a popular strategy, and we were able to actually get a kind of a mini-mass movement going in Soweto, which actually forced the government later to declare a moratorium on cutoffs and to actually scrap some of the arrears and try and build more of a relationship with the residents.
That's a really fantastic and very powerful strategy. Patrick, can you talk a little bit maybe about how you see the strategies which Trevor and his comrades created in Soweto and in other parts of South Africa, how that relates to ideas of the commons and to practices of commoning?
Yes, I'll start saying that there are probably three profound victories in commoning since the end of apartheid. And you're hearing from really the key leader of the first one, and it started in the late 90s. But something else came up at the same time, which was intellectual property as a barrier to getting AIDS medicines for about 5 million people living with HIV. And they needed to get generic versions supplied by the state. What was available was $10,000 a year prescriptions per person, supplied by monopoly patented big pharma corps for AZT or for the other antiretroviral medicines. So these medicines were not something that you could get, and therefore about 350,000 people additional to the normal death toll succumbed because they weren't given these medicines. And it was a treatment action campaign that commoned intellectual property, supported at some stage finally by African health ministers, by people at UN AIDS, but particularly by Médecins Sans Frontières, which was doing sort of free services in a couple of the major townships. But also it became a big movement where ACTA in the United States offered solidarity. And that was in a way our first experience of an international struggle to get the class apartheid system rolled back. A subsequent one just recently achieved was the commoning of tertiary education, of university education through free education, at least for 90% of the masses of the students coming in whose parents are earning less than $2,000 or is it $20,000 per year roughly. So if below that, which is 90% of the tertiary education student body, then you get free education and you get a grant to live on. And that was after 3 years of very, very intense national struggles and many more years of micro struggles at campuses. I think what the Electricity Commons, the victory was in 2000, but it's never been a full victory. Trevor will be the first to tell you, since his PhD was about the struggles against service delivery, unsatisfactory, disconnections, high prices, the failure to really roll out electricity, water, sanitation, municipal services. And that, I think, broke a lot of new ground by identifying that although they won first on the streets by reconnecting, so they set up commons, which were mutual aid systems in places like Soweto, won again in public policy by getting free basic electricity, but it's not enough. And Trevor, for most of your comrades, I think it's 50 kilowatt hours per household per month. In some cities, it's a little bit higher. But for Eskom, the national provider for Soweto, I think that's all you're getting. So maybe you want to pick up as to whether those struggles. Now, even though you won, you got to keep fighting.
Yeah, well, yeah, well, that's the nature of the struggle, you know, because I'm a socialist, so I think that as long as, you know, the capitalist class or big business is running the show, there'll be problems for the working class, for the poor, for ordinary people, you know. So, you know, the bosses, they give with one hand and take with the other. And then we always trying to push them back, you know, to make gains. But sometimes when our organizations and our movements get weak, they might also, you know, push us back and, you know, recoup some of the gains we have made. So yes, it's true. So what happened is we could have won the fight decisively if, say, there was a government which was fully committed to providing safe, clean energy for all, okay? Yeah. So, for example, later, one of our struggles was to fight, you know, to join the climate change movement. You know, what I'm trying to say is that even if we had won the electricity, we would still be left with another struggle to save the earth. So it's true that, you know, the struggle goes on. So at the moment, the electricity company is busy, I would say, punishing Soweto and punishing the working class, demanding payment again. Remember that after our struggle during my days, 75% of Sowetans stopped paying for electricity. So, you know, people were getting free electricity all these years. But now the electricity company is in crisis because, you know, I don't know, they don't have enough money, they can't provide enough electricity because their systems are in a mess, okay? So now there's this vindictive and also, I would say, scapegoating of the campaign for free electricity as to blame for the present crisis. So there's a lot of talk about the Soweto debt. You know, Soweto owes 20 billion rand. I don't know how much in dollars, you know. But if you look at that debt, it's a small fraction of the overall debt of the electricity company, which is about 600 billion. So there is that going on. And also, as Patrick said, there is a definite neoliberal shift at the management of the electricity corporation, Eskom, because they've now appointed a CEO who comes straight from the private sector with a history of destroying jobs in restructuring and, you know, helping companies which were going down. Yeah. And the government is buying that because now our president is also, in a way, a neoliberal himself, because it's Ramaphosa who is actually a billionaire, you know. Yeah, he's a billionaire, although he's got a history of being a trade unionist. But his recent history is a billionaire with stakes in the mines, chairperson of Coca-Cola South Africa, of McDonald's, and some of these big cell phone corporations. Yeah. So the last thing to say there is that this squeeze on the working class does not relate only to Soweto, which is the biggest township or ghetto in South Africa, but all working class and poor areas are being squeezed. In fact, Eskom, the company, has said it's going to have power fail because we have these blackouts. It's called load shedding, you know, when the system cannot provide. So they've said now openly, they're going to do more load shedding in poor working class areas because they're not paying. So this is the situation we're in, and it's a crisis for the working class, for people in the townships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is human rights infraction of the most kind of glaring kind to target poor people, working class people, and to cut electricity to them, because, you know, it's in many cases placing them in grave danger. We have similar kinds of struggles in the United States. Last summer in New York, during a heat wave, our private utility cut power to poor and predominantly African-American parts of New York City. Even though people there had been paying, but they had to do the same kind of load shedding. And so they targeted areas of color that are most affected by urban heat. And so there's been a lot of political struggle around the problems of the private utility and how it's not answerable to people's needs, how it's racist, and engaged in these human rights infractions. So, you know, it's quite tragic that ESCOM, which is nominally a public utility, is behaving this way as well, and behaving in a very neoliberal sort of manner. So I wanted to ask both of you about a sort of general question of how you see South Africa moving away from coal towards renewable energy. You know, I was quite inspired by the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. They had this plan for millions of climate jobs, which included very progressive ideas about energy transition and creating a lot of jobs in that sector, as well as in, you know, public transportation and building more efficient houses in the townships in South Africa. But my understanding is that those plans have been sort of set aside by the union, by NUMSA, because of the economic crisis of South Africa and the levels of unemployment. And yet, as you've just said, Trevor, you know, they've brought in the CEO who's from the private sector, who cuts a lot of jobs. So it seems there are real contradictions there. And from what I understand, also a lot of the kind of offers to create renewable energy have been given to private firms in South Africa. So maybe the two of you could sort of help explain how the transition away from South Africa's kind of fossil fuel assets has been going or not going, and what some of the biggest obstacles are in moving forward in that direction.
Patrick.
Trevor's looking for me to just toss out a few, let's say, contextual arguments. And then, Trevor, your sense of the politics of the metal workers, NUMSA, the most left union, also the biggest union among the majors, about 350,000 workers. To me, the critical green fusion is under stress, and at that point the green goes. And it is not simply in the coal sector, in which coal-fired power plants are organized by the metal workers. They also have some members who are in coal, along with mine work, who are very pro-coal. And then there's other high carbon activities like smelting, where the NUMSA union predominates, or also very high intensity carbon centric production processes for export. And then you've got an industry where there's a national, very desperate situation in which just saving jobs, preventing complete meltdowns, is apparently the is doing with very little, because the Million Climate Jobs campaign, that is a group that the Alternative Information and Development Center gathered together, does have all manner of arguments and examples of how smelter workers or coal-fired electricity workers could transition to renewable energy, or to a myriad, in fact, a million other climate-related jobs. And maybe, Trevor, you've the United Front, which brings those metal workers back into connection with community, social movements, feminists, youth, LGBTQ. What is the prospect of a civil and uncivil society combination that brings the just transition or a Green New Deal or
Patrick's connection seems to be a little bit slow, but Trevor, can you pick up on his question about the political affiliations and conjunctions which might facilitate and make real some of the proposals for 1 million climate jobs?
Yeah, so I've got personal experience because towards the end of 2011, I was employed for 4 months by this NGO, the AIDC, the Alternative Information Development Corporation, to run or to be a national organizer temporarily for their Million Climate Jobs campaign. So I got quite involved. I had to, talk to unions and talk to communities, try and get the two sides together. And then remember, in South Africa, we had COP17 here. So among the social movements, there was a very strong or developing climate justice, anti-climate change movement. So the movements were open to this and the unions. So, but with NGOs, there's that problem because, you have to have the support of movements and trade unions. So with the movements, you get their shortcomings. For example, most of them at that time were organizing the poorest of the poor. So people are confronted with, questions of survival. Actually, they need the organized working class labor to be strong. But within the trade union movement, we have problems there. Some of them to do with the split in the movement after the Marikana massacre. So one major problem of the union, I think everywhere in the world, is what I can call the politics of class cooperation or reformism, where unions on the one hand are fighting the bosses, but on the other they are hoping, to make deals with the bosses rather than fighting them, over the cliff. And then in South Africa, the problem was bigger, multiplied, because the biggest union federation, COSATU, was in a formal political alliance with the ruling party, the ANC, and the Communist Party. So this was a real chain, on the struggle. But in any case, Marikana, the massacre, was a direct challenge of this class cooperation, because the miners said, our union, the National Union of Mine Workers, which by the way was the biggest COSATU affiliate at the time, is not servicing us. So they went out on what you can call a Wildcat Strike, okay? So that's how the massacre happened. So this movement, or this strike, exposed the limitations of the unions to the extent that there were cracks in the unions, ultimately leading to NUMSA, the Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, being kicked out of COSATU. So there was that. And then after that, as the Million Climate Jobs, campaign was going on, NUMSA, having been kicked out, in a way, siding with the massacred miners, NUM denouncing the dead. Can you see? Yeah, this is what happened. Yeah. Terrible, yeah. So in fact, even the NUMSA leadership was in a way pulled by the anger of its own rank and file, because in that special Congress in 2013, where NUMSA decided to pull out or not to support the ANC. This move was driven from the floor. Yeah, from the floor. In instances where the leadership tried to slow it down, they couldn't. Okay, so it was pure anger by the masses, by workers. So this, in any case, NUMSA had always been slightly on the left of COSATU. Yeah, so they've got that history. Yeah, yeah. So the leadership also was not entirely, you know, centrist or on the right. So in any case, down the line, the NUMSA took up a strong position for what is called the just transition. So we must make sure that no worker loses a job as we move from fossil fuels to renewable energy. On the other hand, the Mine Workers Union, NUM, took a more, we are defending jobs position. Remember, they are defending coal mine workers. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whereas with NUMSA, it's more metal. But increasingly, NUMSA itself is organizing in the mines now. Yeah, yeah. And now, in fact, one reason it was kicked out, the official reason it was kicked out of COSATU was that it was encroaching on the scope of other unions. Okay? Yeah. Okay, we know that's not the major reason, but that was happening. So as soon as NUMSA was out, now it's freer to mobilize and organize and recruit in the mines, okay? And then another problem now with NUMSA is that I think within the union, there was a bit, or there is a bit of what I can call, you know, I don't know how to say it in a euphemism, sectarian politics. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you find that comrades up top, you know, they don't just accept your solidarity. They want to see whether you're a good comrade or not. I think it's a hangover from their days within the Communist Party, you know, yeah, yeah. A bit of Stalinist politics, you know, from the past. Yeah, so this has served to undermine and erode to the extent, so to the extent that within the union, maybe one could say, you know, maybe internal democracy is eroded, but also the positions on top are not that progressive now. They still say they are for just transition, but in the same breath, they talk about supporting nuclear energy. In the same breath, they talk about, no, let us explore various, I don't know, combinations. They've got a term, you know, permutations of the kind of energy sources South Africa should employ, rather than saying, we don't want fossil fuels, we want to move to renewables. But of course, they've got a strong and progressive position calling for the socialization of renewables, like you said, because renewable energy now is being hijacked by private corporations who are trying to jump over and have what you can call a green neoliberal dispensation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But thank you. That's really helpful to understand, because, you know, looking at the Million Climate Jobs document, which I'll put a link to on my publisher's website, so many of the goals articulated seem extremely progressive. And so understanding why it's hard for South Africa to realize those goals is really useful, I think, because obviously we need to fight for energy transition at the center of empire here in the United States, you know, the place where people consume the most fossil fuels on the planet. But we also need to make sure that countries in the global South have the means to make that transition. So I wanted to kind of close our conversation by asking you both about the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, the leadership here in the United States has mishandled the situation horribly, and because of that, we're facing a really grave health, but also economic crisis. It's also a crisis, though, of fossil capitalism, and it's looking like much of the fracking industry in the United States is going to collapse because of lack of consumption of fossil fuels, as well as a kind of price war between the Saudis and the Russians. How has the pandemic, which is also increasingly grave in South Africa, from what I understand, how has that shaped struggles around energy, if it has, and for social justice? And, you know, do you see any kind of equivalent to what some critics here in the United States have said, that this is a potential opening for a more progressive and transformational politics around energy democracy in the United States? Are similar arguments being made in South Africa? How is the pandemic playing out?
Maybe, Trevor, if I just start, because my internet connection is unstable, you can hear me okay? Or I'm mute? Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, sorry about that. We can hear you, Patrick. Yeah, thanks.
That's fine. I'm sure you've got a good editor who can clean everything up. And I do apologize profoundly about this bad internet connection. I hope I can use short statements that you can. Trevor, just where you were saying, the metal workers have been slow to really embrace the radical potential of socialist energy that is renewable. One of the reasons is that they're tied into an export-oriented model that's high carbon intensive. They say they need which would include not just, but as you say, they're thinking about nuclear. So one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has compelled is a potential rethink exporting to world markets where many of the commodities have collapsed. So that would be, for example, commodities like coal, the price is down about 30%, but also our base metals. Some of them are where the metal workers and where exports, for example, of aluminium, of aluminum, of steel, have met not only the current crisis, but the overproduction problem more generally, accumulated Chinese steel, aluminium, and heavy metal sector. And that means that the localization agenda, which would be less emphasizing the export of either raw materials, just the mines that turn out gold and iron ore and platinum and coal, but also the smelted products, the high energy intensive, high carbon intensive products. If those are under stress, and if a localization agenda, which is reindustrializing appliances and electronics, as well as to bring back clothing, textile. Now, these are the inward-oriented strategy for import substitution, as the phrase goes, that are sometimes criticized by internationalist Marxists for good reason. There's obviously no desire here to pit one working class against the other with protectionist barriers, and often have xenophobic parts of this as well. And those are definitely dangerous tendencies, as they are in the US and everywhere. But still, the opportunity to make the case that a full reboot of an economy that was run by a complex, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, a coal tycoon, not just a lawnman owner associated with the massacre Trevor talked about. That reboot, that potential to say, let's meet basic needs. Let's make sure that the electricity to the poorest people, to the rural areas, that the prices aren't sky high, forcing people to turn to coal or wood or paraffin inside their houses. Rolling out water and sanitation, because we know now that 44% of households have a tap in their house they can wash their hands and keep COVID hygienic. These are the big picture problems, I think, that COVID-19 presents, not as an opportunity, but as an imperative, right? An imperative for anyone concerned with social justice in the most unequal country in the world, with the most corrupt capitalist class, according to PwC, and with usually in the top 2 or 3 militant labor movements in the world. These connections between labor and community, women, youth, have to get stronger. I mean, I think they will inexorably in united struggles, but the divide and conquer capacity of our African National Congress talk left, walk right nationalists is serious. Trevor's grappled with it since he was thrown out of the ANC for opposing municipal privatization in 1999, and for over 20 years he's been one of the leading strategists. What do you think, Trevor? How do we get through COVID-19 and take forward the mutual aid systems that you have developed in the townships into a commons, into a climate justice, and into eco-socialism?
Yeah, well, I think one of our problems, just moving from the broader and going down, is the type of economy and country South Africa is. You know, it's a semi-peripheral, so-called emerging economy. Patrick would call it a sub-imperialist country. But what happens is that nationalism still has got a track here. So people still feel like, you know, we are South Africans, we must defend our own, can you see? And that is used by the ruling class and even by the capitalists to at least trap, you know, the top leadership into strategies which are supposed to support our economy. So, you know, I'm just adding to what Patrick is saying about there is that question of which economic policies are best for the country, for the working class, for the poor, but also for the world. So there is also a debate and maybe a lack of, you know, strong ideas to get us through and paint a clearer vision. And of course, when socialism as a goal kind of disappears or gets faint, you know, when that hope dies, then it's harder to come up with solutions. But yes, I agree, COVID-19 does present a kind of opportunity. Yeah. So for example, at first, most organizations, working class organizations, especially their leadership, unions, they rallied behind the South African government, behind its leadership in the fight against COVID-19. Firstly, out of fear, you know, who wants to die, you know, and who wants a chaotic response. But in any case, when the government started, I think it started well, you know, the Minister of Health, you know, because there were hardly 3 people, infected people, but the guy was already moving, preparing us, can you see? Yeah. And it was, and at that time, you know, Italy was being decimated. So people were saying, hey, you know, this guy is on the ball, this government must be supported. Okay, and also for the wrong reasons, you know. Let's stand behind our government, who are part of the alliance, ANC, SACP, COSATU Alliance, etc. Okay, so there was that. And then, and also the fear also reached the ordinary people who are suddenly, you know, with the lockdowns now, who are suddenly caught between, if I don't go to work, I'm going to starve. But if I go to work, I'm going to die. Okay, so that's the thing. But to understand working class fear, to understand the fear of the poor, is that these things are already happening before COVID. It's their everyday life to fear, the fear of losing your job, the fear of hunger, the fear of poverty, the fear of being sick and not getting adequate medical attention. So the virus was devastating in that sense. So the fear grew, which gave the government space to be the leader. But gradually, we can see now the fight back. We can see workers saying, the health workers, for example, we're going to stop working because we don't have PPE, you know, the protection. We see workers saying, I'm not going down that mine because, you know, I might die. Indeed, you find even COSATU, I think last week, because the government allowed our main means of transport, which is these kumbis, microbuses. So they were allowed to have 70%, you know, a load. Now the government is saying 100%, which means you sit 4 in a seat, you know? Yeah. So even COSATU, you know, which is part of the alliance, has threatened a strike, a general strike, if this issue is not reversed. I don't know whether they'll follow up, but still they're saying it. Certainly, the new Union Federation, SAFTU, you know, which NUMSA is part of, has just issued a very good statement against, you know, what the government is doing, against the neoliberal budget. Apparently, the government promised 500 billion rands, you know, for COVID, but actually it's only issuing 170. Most of it is taken, you know, so those are the kind of dynamics. And then the last point is that on the ground, we have an attempt called the COVID-19 People's Coalition. About 200 different organizations, small organizations all over the country, NGOs, have come together. So they're trying, you know, to do things, have campaigns, and they are even going out to the street in small. So I think the fear of going out into the street, you know, to protest, in a way, has been helped by the Black Lives Matter campaign, because the comrades can see, hey, the Americans are doing it. You know, if you really believe in your cause, go out, risk it, and fight it out. So there is that hope that COVID will help us to regroup and to demand things which are going to benefit the majority of the people.
Thank you so much, Trevor, and also Patrick. We're clearly in a very, very deep crisis right now, but it's so interesting to hear your perspectives on how movements in South Africa are being galvanized and thinking about systemic alternatives, and how energy democracy might be a part of that. So you've both been very generous with your time. I think we should probably wrap up right now, but I will put links.
We just have one word to teach you, because the title of this amazing book, People Power, resonates with a slogan that we always finish and end with, right? So if I use my word, I get response from Trevor. So we would want to end, I suspect, with an echo of your book, and it goes like this: Amandla, Amandla, Soweto.
Thank you both so much. You know, I was born in South Africa and have followed all of the struggles from afar. So it's so good to hear that call for people's power coming from both of you in the present moment. Thank you both for your generosity and for your wonderful insights about the struggle of popular forces in South Africa today and over the last few decades.
Well, keep up the great work there, comrade. Yeah, cheers.
Okay.